hello friends, and welcome to Ariel's Twilight Years, how to be a really old model. This is Gareth. He asked to be in the video this month and I cannot deny my little Welsh orangutan anything. Hello! Right, are you going to sit down on the bed now? I do. I'm at home at the moment, but I'm about to go to London to do my first, hopefully not only ever, big talk at a Seed Talks Kink Summit, which I'm very excited about. But once I was asked to do it, I realised not only have I not done a 40-minute long talk ever, like the longest talk straight to an audience that I've ever done has been like sort of 10 minutes. Not only have I never done that before, I have also not watched a whole load of live presentations either, because I went to drama school instead of university and we didn't have lectures. And I've not gone to a whole bunch of public lectures since. So I realised that I was very much at a disadvantage compared to the other people speaking at the summit who have done this many times before. So I've been practicing. I've written my PowerPoint presentation. So for today's YouTube video, I'm going to rehearse it. It's meant to be 40 minutes long, so I'm going to try to make it 40 minutes long on today's video. And I'm doing it for two reasons. One, because a lot of people who would like to come to see the actual talk won't be able to come to it. But two, because I want a record of it, because if I get better at doing things like this in the future, I want to be able to look back at how far I've come. So please be gentle. This is a bit scary. I'm about to completely change character into the version of me that talks to an audience. And I'm going to put the slides up on the screen somehow. I don't know how to do that either. God, so many new things I'm hopefully learning this month. My slides are down here. Hello, I'm Ariel Anderson and welcome to my talk. BDSM, shame, porn and me. I am a BDSM performer. I've been working in this field for 21 years. I originally trained as a classical actress and I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness. I'm hoping we can use events from my life in order to delve further into the subject of sexual shame, the role of the media and wider society in perpetuating that shame, what we can do about it, and whether things in our society are getting better, whether there is reason to be optimistic. So let's get started. To begin with, I'm guessing quite a lot of the people in this room do know something about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but just in case anyone doesn't, they are a quasi-Christian religious sect. They've been in existence since the early 20th century, and they have a lot of rules that their members need to keep. Some of you will have heard that they don't celebrate Christmas, birthdays, they don't celebrate Easter, you're not allowed to have blood transfusions or eat black pudding. You're not allowed to go to discos. I wasn't allowed to go to school assemblies. So there are a lot of rules in place for Jehovah's Witnesses to keep them rather separate from the rest of the world. And the reason for this is they are an apocalyptic sect. So they believe the world is about to end. And the way to get through Armageddon is by keeping all these rules. What we talk about less is the sexual rules that the Jehovah's Witnesses live by as well. And I think the reason they get talked about less is that they are rather more typical of other religious cults, but also other religious denominations, at least historically. So for a Jehovah's Witness, sex is heterosexual, married, there's no masturbation allowed, there's no oral sex allowed, and there was just generally the feeling that God would always be present in your bedroom, watching and judging and making sure you weren't having too much fun or straying too far from the regulation type of sex. In terms of gender roles, I guess unsurprisingly, they were also pretty traditional. So in the Jehovah's Witness church, men take all the leadership roles. They're the ones who get to stand on the platform talking to the congregation. They lead the prayers. They're the ones who take the leading roles in the management structure from the grassroots of the organisation right up to the top of the structure. And they really have all the power, both within the church and also within the individual families. Women, on the other hand, unsurprisingly, were expected to be modest, obedient, quiet. They didn't get to lead any kind of worship at all. They were pretty much invisible, really. Their job was to be maternal and domestic. So as a girl growing up in the 1980s, there was no one in the Jehovah's Witness church as a female role model for me. So, you may be wondering why I'm telling you all of this about Jehovah's Witness norms and rules. Well, there is a reason. Let me explain. The impact of Jehovah's Witness teaching on me turned out to be pretty much catastrophic, which is not to say it wouldn't have been for other children. I now know lots of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who found the whole process of growing up as a Jehovah's Witness pretty traumatic. But perhaps it was particularly so for me because I wasn't growing up to have a normal, typical sexuality. I was growing up kinky. Now, as a child, I didn't realise that's what was happening, but from my earliest memories, from being 3 years old, I just always thought the bits of stories where someone got tied up or punished or spanked or captured were just the best bits of stories. So my first crushes were on Captain Hook and Princess Tiger Lily from Peter Pan, and I had a vague sense that this should be private, so I never told anyone about this special interest, but it was just like a quiet little hobby of mine, collecting these stories and enjoying thinking about them. Then when I reached 16, I realised suddenly and hideously that this wasn't just an innocent hobby, this was the foundation of my sexuality, and honestly I don't think I could have been more horrified. It's hard to describe quite how ashamed I was, and I assumed it was just me. Although I realised it was a sexuality, I didn't realise it was a sexuality that other people might share, so I've really never felt so lonely in my entire life. That probably sounds very dramatic, but having grown up in such a conservative religion where any deviation from the norm was seen as a sin, I suppose the only way I can really compare how I felt about myself as a result of realising what my sexuality was perhaps if you woke up one day and suddenly realised you were a paedophile. I mean, I felt like I really shouldn't exist anymore. Because on one hand, I'd got the Jehovah's Witness teachings about sin, and on the other hand, I was a term into my A-level sociology course, and we'd started studying deviance, including sexual deviance. And the sociologists we were studying seemed to broadly be of the opinion that not only was sexual deviance bad for the individuals, but it was bad for society. So, trapped between these two worldviews, the only option left to me seemed to be suicide, which possibly sounds a bit illogical, but I'd grown up with the idea that we should copy what Jesus did, and well, what did Jesus do? He allowed himself to be put to death for the good of the world, and having discovered something catastrophically evil about myself, I thought I should kill myself for the good of society that didn't need someone like me polluting it. It was a hideously lonely feeling, but I did think maybe the best thing I could do was just take myself out of commission, take myself out of the gene pool, and not pollute society with my disgusting sexual tastes. Fortunately for me, the Jehovah's Witnesses also very much frowned on suicide, which was seen as just as bad a sin as anything else. So I was rather trapped, and I didn't want to layer another sin on top of my existing sin. So I remained kind of paralysed for a while, wanting to kill myself but not quite daring to, because of the additional sin I'd be heaping onto myself. And after a while, I decided the thing I would do is try to atone for what I saw as this horrific sexuality of mine by trying to be the most useful member of society that I could be, to do as well in my exams as possible, to be a good person, and to suppress all my desires, to try to be normal. And of course, I now realise this is a journey that many troubled teenagers and young people go on, having realised that their sexuality is not as normal as they'd have liked. They tend to shut down and keep things secret, and that's what I did for 9 more years of my life. So what is important about my story, which is rather gloomy and somewhat extreme? Why am I telling you? Well, the reason is that these ideas that I grew up with, they're not specific to the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're not just specific to this obscure sect. They're actually only an exaggerated version of any society with a Christian history. Rules like this about what's acceptable and what's not are very common, actually. And as a result, guilt is widespread. We tend to self-censor ourselves sexually in concern that we're not going to be accepted by other people. And when you're comfortable judging others, as I was brought up to be very comfortable judging other people, both non-Jehovah's Witnesses for not being Jehovah's Witnesses, and then Jehovah's Witnesses who we didn't believe were doing as good a job as being Jehovah's Witnesses as our family was. And one of the problems with living like that is that it's very difficult not to turn that judgment onto yourself. It's very hard to have any kind of compassion towards yourself when you haven't developed that towards other people. So I certainly reached the age of 16 with a very judgmental attitude, which I struggled to get rid of. Inevitably, dealing with all this judgment as a result of my religious upbringing, I did look elsewhere to see if I could find comfort. If I'd found only sociologists who were saying actually being kinky is totally okay, it would have been very, very comforting. But what did wider society tell me? What did it look like to a kinky, guilty 16-year-old? Well, you may be thinking, probably, as I started to look out into the wider world, I might have started to feel a bit comforted. Because after all, we're more sexually liberal as a society than we were. And today, 37% of us in the UK are in fact atheists. So surely I would have met more liberal values as I looked outside my family and my family's religion. Well, I often think that if you want to start judging, looking at a society's values, a great place to start is their artwork, especially their very popular artwork. I was doing media studies A-level along with sociology A-level, and I was watching TV and films for the first time in my life because I'd grown up without a television. As a result, I was very influenced by what I saw. I was fascinated by it all, and I hadn't got the level of desensitization that other people my age would have got from watching lots of TV and films growing up. So as a result, I was very impressed and very impressionable when it came to mainstream drama and film. So if there had been some positive representation of people with sexualities somewhat like mine, I think it might have meant the absolute world to me and been incredibly comforting. So what did I see? What would anyone growing up in the last 20 or 30 years see when it comes to mainstream popular fiction, TV and film drama? Well, this is the kind of thing I found. To begin with, you do see quite a lot of sexually dominant and sadistic men in TV drama and film. I think the reason for that is they bring the drama. They're good for being an antagonist. And so, and when I say sexually sadistic / dominant, I'm talking about people with a recreational / sexual interest in hurting other people. So, Game of Thrones, for example, which is recent, gave us 2 leading roles, examples of men who are sexual sadists. Then Girl with a Dragon Tattoo similarly gave us 2 male leading roles, sexual dominants and sadists. Outlander, which was immensely successful and popular on Amazon Prime, gave us another leading man who's a sexual sadist. And none of these men are good. Like, it's not like you can aspire to be like any of these men if you're a young, dominant sadist. These men aren't suitable husbands, and they're not represented as heroic, quite the opposite. And so imagine growing up feeling like you might turn out like this if these were your only potential role models. I mean, it's disastrous. It could barely be more negative. But that's just dominant men. What about submissive or masochistic men? Well, they don't tend to be portrayed as actually dangerous, which I guess is good, but they do tend to be portrayed as either impossibly damaged and tragic or dreadfully damaged and funny. I mean, they're often seen as quite pathetic, and they very, very rarely get to be in leading roles. The Boys, which 2 of these pictures is from on Amazon Prime, is a recent drama, and honestly it could be a lot worse because at least there is representation of kinky people. And the submissive men come out of it fairly generously when compared with the first submissive man I saw represented in film, which was on Pulp Fiction. When I look back at Pulp Fiction, having the first scene, actual BDSM scene that I'd ever watched in a mainstream movie, I mean, it's so violent, there's no consent. It kind of equates kinky people with just being rapists, so it's absolutely horrible. And compared to that, things like The Boys are better, but the representation is still highly problematic. But what about women? Well, honestly, submissive women do get a slightly easier ride than submissive men, but we don't see them anywhere near as often. However, in the last 30 years, there have been 2 portrayals of women, submissive, masochistic women in leading roles that I thought were pretty good. That's Secretary with Maggie Gyllenhaal and A Dangerous Method starring Keira Knightley. And you know, they're both leading roles, so they're getting a better deal than submissive men. And at least both of these characters are portrayed by beautiful women. But Secretary starts out with our leading character leaving a mental institution, and Dangerous Method begins with Keira Knightley being committed to a mental institution, and she's then a patient in the mental hospital for the rest of the body of the film. So, if you were growing up submissive and female, these kind of portrayals aren't going to stop you feeling like there's something wrong with you. So, what does this kind of thing lead to? Does it really matter? I would say it does matter, because the message to kinky people is that we should really keep quiet, because if people know about us, they are going to judge us. The message to the rest of the population is it's totally okay to fear us or laugh at us or both. And I don't think anyone, any particular subculture or any particular minority group just automatically deserves uniformly positive representation. I mean, police officers don't get that in drama. Psychiatrists don't get that in drama. I mean, even florists don't always get represented in a positive way. But this kind of portrayal of kinky people, when it's not balanced out by more positive options, it does impact on the real life treatment of real life kinky people. And so I think it would be useful to look at what these kind of attitudes translate to when we start looking at how kinky people, real kinky people, are portrayed in mainstream news media. Let's have a look. I'm going to show you just 3 examples. There are many more, but I've chosen 3 which had a particularly strong impact on me. The first one is Stephen Milligan, the Conservative MP, who died in 1994 when I was 16. He killed himself by mistake in what was likely an autoerotic asphyxiation episode that just went wrong. And the press coverage at the time was just the most gleeful, cruel, atrocious thing I've really seen in my life at that point. His death was treated like a joke because he'd been found wearing women's underwear. And it told me, as it told a generation of kinky people who saw this coverage, what people would think of us if they knew about our sexual tastes. I know politicians do always tend to get particularly unkind treatment in the press, but it certainly told me what my 6th form peers would think of me if I let them know what I was into sexually. And it was footage like this that kept me silent for 9 more years. I don't know if many people remember his name anymore, but to me, it will always be synonymous with BDSM, and I guess that might not be how he'd want to really be remembered. Then in 2002, the Surrey schoolgirl Millie Dowler was abducted and murdered, and her father was an early police suspect. Now obviously that is not in itself surprising because close family members are always looked at in cases like this. But Bob Dowler, Millie Dowler's father, had BDSM magazines and equipment at the house, and when the police found this, it looked to them as though he was of an increased risk to children. And so they actually didn't look outside the family when the murderer was, in fact, a local person who was outside the family, who they could have possibly found a lot sooner if they hadn't been going after Millie Dowler's father. Now, that led on to when the murderer was caught and was on trial for Millie's murder and Bob Dowler was called as a witness, he was cross-examined extensively by the defence barrister, who took the direction of shaming him for being kinky, telling him he couldn't possibly be a good father because he was kinky, and trying to get him to agree that perhaps his daughter had run away from home because she was so ashamed and disgusted of her father. It was broadly seen afterwards as quite a travesty of justice because it was such a traumatic thing for him to go through, and after all, he was already traumatised. He was a victim, and his sexuality was not relevant to the horrible thing that happened to his daughter. He was extensively shamed by police, then media, and in court over pornography that he owned that was perfectly legal and legally acquired. And the fact that he felt compelled to initially lie to police about having looked at porn just shows me the level of shame that he quite rightly understood that he should have because of how people would treat him if they knew he was kinky. So I can't say he was wrong to try to keep it quiet, because when they did find it, exactly what he feared is what happened. And then there is Max Mosley's expose in 2008. Max Mosley was secretly filmed in a private BDSM play session in 2008. He'd organised a BDSM session with friends, and one of them filmed it secretly and sold the footage to the News of the World, which then falsely accused him of having a Nazi-themed orgy. He was then subjected to massive invasion of his privacy, hideous shaming, and he suffered permanent reputational damage, despite the fact that eventually he did manage to win his case against News of the World. But by then he'd stepped down from his job with Formula One, and his life was, I can imagine, it probably felt in many ways ruined. So, looking at those three stories just as an example, it's not like it leaves a particularly positive impression of how the news media deals with real life kinky people. But here I am, an escapee of a religious cult, on a platform talking about my sexual tastes without any shame. So given that I grew up in the religion that I did, and then I've been living in this society that is hardly kink positive, how did I get here? Like, how did I get over the hideous amount of shame that I was feeling at 16 and the suppression of my sexual tastes that I tried to enforce after that? Well, there was an unlikely hero who's about to enter the story. Because when I was 25, I started working as a professional model, and in my first week as a model, I was invited to a gallery which had an exhibition of artwork. I went along to it, and I didn't know what the theme of the exhibition was, but when I got inside, I discovered that it was a BDSM themed exhibition. So I saw sculptures, paintings, and photographs representing the sexuality that I thought I was completely alone in the world in having. And it was an extraordinarily cathartic experience, because by the end of that night I'd started to meet the people who would become part of my community, and it was the most beautiful thing, because for the first time I saw dominant people represented without judgment of their character. I saw submissive people represented in artwork as beautiful and desirable, and for the first time I was seeing a whole bunch of kinky characters who were not being portrayed as though they might possibly be murderers. It was extraordinary. So I decided to work in this field. I entered the world of BDSM artwork at 25 years old, and I've been working in it ever since. And at first, I did this in order to have the experiences that I didn't know I'd ever get to have. Working as a BDSM model meant that I got to work all over the world with people who were professionally competent at bondage and spanking and all sorts of other BDSM activities. And at first, I just enjoyed myself experiencing all these things and making friends in a social group where I felt I belonged. But after I kind of got used to doing that, I realised that this job also had the power to help me tell other people, like the guilty teenager I'd been, that they're not alone, that there are other people with tastes like theirs. And so the reason I stayed in this business and the reason I still work in this field is because of the opportunity to reach people who feel anything but okay with their sexuality and try to make them feel better about it by at least being able to say, me too. So, you may be wondering, what's it like being part of the solution, making people feel less ashamed about their sexuality? Well, working in pornography is a kind of mixed bag, to be honest. I love it, but a lot of the people in my field are working in secret, not daring to tell their families what they do for a living. I am an exception to that. But 2 years ago, I went to a friend's funeral. She was a prolific and incredibly successful bondage model. And when she died, and members of her community came to her funeral, it became apparent that she hadn't told a single member of her family in her whole career and life. And they were only just finding out that their family member had not only had a career in kink, she'd been famous. And I wish I could say this is a really unusual story, but it's not. Most people don't dare to tell their families because they're afraid of judgment. And as a result, if things go wrong in their professional lives, they don't have any family support because they can't tell their families what they do. We are, as a group, routinely discriminated against by multiple platforms, but including PayPal, who shut our accounts down if they find out what we do. Airbnb, who do the same, Visa and MasterCard, YouTube, OnlyFans. There are many, many platforms and companies who do not like kinky sex workers working with them. I know people who've been made to leave town, having been outed for being kinky. I even know a couple who had to leave their country for that reason. I know a couple who were reported to social services for being a potential risk to their child. And you might be thinking, but surely this isn't because these people are kinky. Surely it's because they're sex workers. And that's true. And mainstream sex workers experience a lot of this same discrimination. But while kinky civilians who don't work in this field may not get directly discriminated against, they see the discrimination against them. And I think that probably does feed into the level of shame that they experience, because if you are a private individual who's just quietly kinky on your own, it's not like the shame isn't there, as I found out on the very next slide. In 2017, I started shooting what's called in the business custom videos for individual customers. So people would contact me and commission me to shoot their specific fantasy on camera, and I'd send them the video, after which I would resell that video on various platforms worldwide that allow you to do that. And it was a very illuminating experience having members of the public writing to me on a regular basis telling me their fantasies. So I shoot about 10 custom videos a week, and so I'm getting 10 to 20 emails a week about these customs. And this is how the experience tends to go. Someone will contact me on email, and the first thing they'll do is they will apologise. They'll say things like, I'm sorry this is weird, or I'm sorry you might not want to do this, or I hope you won't think anything bad of me, and then they tell me their fantasy. The other thing is that they will often, in this first email, say that they've never told anyone this before, or they've never told anyone in their real life this before. Maybe I'm a safe person because I'm outside their social group. So it's certainly made me aware of how many people just don't dare tell the people they love about their sexual tastes because they're so afraid of rejection and judgment. And then I'll often shoot their video and I'll send it to them. And then a few months later, when it's been on sale worldwide for a few months, they'll contact me and they'll ask me what the sales figures are like. And at first, when this started happening, I didn't really understand why people were asking me. I thought, why does it matter? And then I realised it's because if a video resells well, it means that their fantasy isn't as weird as perhaps they thought, because if 100 people worldwide have bought the video as well, it means they're not alone. And certainly with my background, I understand how very powerful it is to be told that you're not alone. So you might be wondering, given how ashamed these people often are when they first contact me, I'm sure you're wondering what kind of edgy, dodgy stuff I shoot. Well, here are some recent examples of things I've shot. Here I am being a nun who wants to punish you but also fancies you, especially she's very attracted to your testicles. Here's your equestrian aunt who wants to tie you up, and she's going to wear her leather gloves while she does it, of course. Here is your headmistress, who's also a vampire, and I'm afraid she wants to suck your blood. And here I am being eaten alive by a monster hiding in my bed, who is then going to put on my skin like a skin suit, and he's going to pretend to be me. Oh, and finally, here I am being seduced by a medical doctor who's got a PPE fetish, so I'm putting on some nice plastic clothing for him. So these really are not especially edgy, worrying sexual tastes to have. People often ask me when I explain my custom video business, especially journalists, will often ask me what the weirdest request I've ever had is. And it's not a question I welcome, because I don't think anything is weird. Or maybe it's all weird. Maybe all our fantasies would look weird if you typed them out and sent them in an email. So what I tried to do instead is I answer the question of what the most popular fantasy I meet is. And I shoot all these customs, 40 customs a month, and there is one storyline that comes up over and over again. I think 3 or 4 of the custom videos I shoot every week will be this specific story trajectory. And the window dressing of this is different. I'll be wearing different clothes, I'll be playing different characters, but the story arc is as follows. You, the viewer, will see me coming into frame, and I will discover that you are doing something kinky. Doesn't matter what, you could be putting on Wellington boots, or breathing through a gas mask, or rubbing your body through a rubber rain mat, or tying yourself up. My character will express interest in what you're doing, she'll express approval, and then she'll say that she wants to join in. And then the video will become this shared enjoyment of this kinky activity that they'll do together. And what this storyline tells me, and the fact it's so popular tells me, is that so many of us, I think, must have this unfulfilled desire to share our sexuality with someone who just feels the same and doesn't judge us and doesn't reject us. And that's what I'm telling my customers over and over again as I act out these storylines. Now, porn can be useful for that. I see it being useful for that. But of course, it's no substitute for an actual fulfilling relationship. But to have that fulfilling relationship, you have to be comfortable telling the real people in your life, the people you might date, about your tastes. So I'm always hoping that things are going to keep getting better socially and that people will become more and more able to do that. So are things getting better? Well, when I was 21, I saw the first kinky imagery that wasn't highly judgmental as well, and that was when the Spice Girls hit the charts. They quite often dressed like dominatrixes. There were tied up men in their videos, and of course they weren't the first to do it. Madonna had been doing this in the 80s and 90s, but they were the first people that I saw doing it. And in the intervening years since, many recording artists have played with BDSM imagery. Britney Spears and Rihanna and Christina Aguilera, and many, many more, Nicki Minaj. And it's perfectly possible that this has been very, very helpful, specifically for young female dominants, because they have had some positive representation in music videos. They've actually seen their sexuality represented as aspirational. You may be wondering, did that help me? Well, no, it didn't help me, because girl power was very exciting, this kind of repackaging of feminism as sort of more fun and flirty. But the equating of female dominance with this new feminism, well, it wasn't any help at all to me, because plot twist, I'm not dominant, I'm submissive and I'm heterosexual. I want to be tied up and spanked by men. So, what I like in the bedroom, I'm afraid, looks very much like patriarchy. So the fact that female dominance was feminism, to me, once I discovered the Spice Girls, it just made me feel even more of an enemy of society because, well, I was an enemy of feminism. If feminism and female dominance were the way forward into the future, then my sexuality was surely pulling us back towards the patriarchal past. And yeah, it just made me feel worse about myself, if anything. Furthermore, I did have to worry about whether my submissiveness was because of the patriarchy. I mean, was my submissiveness because I'd grown up in a patriarchal cult? And that was a very upsetting thought to me. Here on the left is the front cover of a book my parents had when I was growing up. Leadership is Male. It made me very angry. And on the right is the front cover of 50 Shades of Grey. And I couldn't help when I was writing this talk but see the parallels between these two pictures. Now, I hated the first book. I didn't love 50 Shades of Grey, but it does represent my sexuality in that it's about a male dominant and a female submissive. And when I was younger, it did worry me that I'd grown up sitting, listening to men on the platform, wearing suits, having all the choices, doing all the talking and making all the decisions. And now, in my sex life, what I really very much like is a man in a suit, having all the choices, doing all the talking and making all the decisions. So it made me feel like I hadn't travelled very far emotionally. But then I comforted myself as I got more mature and I got more experience in the kinky world, because I realised that perhaps it was that my sexuality was so immutable, so intrinsic to me, so unchangeable, that even growing up in a patriarchal cult as I did couldn't change my tastes, because after all I've travelled a really long way from the attitudes of my childhood in many other ways. I mean, for example, I wasn't allowed to get up onto the platform at Jehovah's Witness meetings and talk while the men listened to me because I was a girl. And now here I am standing on a platform hoping the men are listening to me, and I love that feeling. So I don't think I can blame my sexuality on childhood trauma. I think it was just there waiting to be uncovered the whole time. And it does take a little while to come to terms with the fact that your sexual tastes don't need to reflect your worldview. But I do know many, many female submissives, apart from just me, who do struggle with the feeling that maybe they're not proper feminists, or maybe they're letting down other women by having the sexual interest that they do. But for male dominance, it's perhaps even worse, because I think a lot of men still are really socialised into the belief that they should be chivalrous, they should be gentlemanly, and that they should treat women as equals as well. And coming to terms with the fact that you don't want to do that in the bedroom with a consenting partner can be a little bit on the difficult side. But now I do understand that what I want in bed doesn't reflect at all the way I want the world to be. I was interested to discover, however, that society hadn't perhaps caught up with my way of thinking when I wrote my memoir, which is the story of a submissive masochist who fancies dominant men. To begin with, when I was looking for a literary agent, I was met with the feedback that it wasn't really an acceptable story because I wasn't dominant. The MeToo campaign was referenced by several agents who said post MeToo it was just a very confrontational story to tell. And then when I finally did find an agent and he started approaching publishers, the feedback we got was that if I could dress the book up as fiction, it would probably have a much better chance of being published. And again, the hashtag MeToo campaign was referenced, because again it just seemed to them as too confrontational a story. Now, I did get a publishing deal, so it wasn't the end of the world, but the idea that I needed to either pretend I was a female dominant or a fictional submissive to get my story told was very interesting, because I don't think that a sexuality like mine is incompatible with being pro-Me Too or anti-sexual assault and harassment, I don't think those two things are incompatible at all, because just as sex without consent is rape, BDSM activities without consent is just assault. And people within the BDSM community are perfectly well aware of that, because BDSM is only okay if we know that it's a game. And what MeToo, the MeToo campaign was addressing, was nothing to do with consensual activity in the bedroom between people who like and respect each other. So, why do I work in porn 21 years on? Well, the reason for it is that it's the most powerful way I have found of being able to try to help normalise a wide variety of sexual activities and a wide variety of sexual identities. With my porn, I can reach a huge audience, far larger than the audience I can ever reach with my writing. Porn showed me, personally, that I wasn't alone, and it was the beginning of making me feel like there was nothing wrong with me either. So it's what I've used to show other people that they're not alone either for the last 21 years. So, in conclusion, I feel as though I've travelled so far from a Jehovah's Witness childhood to becoming a BDSM porn star. I spent my childhood years and teenage years knocking on people's doors, telling them that the things they wanted to do, including in the bedroom, were wrong. And now I've spent my adult life going onto the internet and telling people that the things they want to do, especially in the bedroom, are completely legitimate. And I do feel like one of those things might have actually done some good. So, perhaps after all, although I've travelled a long way in some ways, perhaps I am still an evangelist. So thank you for allowing me to evangelise to you today. And now I would love to hear if anyone has any questions. That's the end. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. It is getting better, but I still sometimes just completely fumble over words. And I think I might lose track of what I'm saying a lot more when there are people to actually look at. Sometimes I start a sentence and then I can't remember what the beginning of the sentence was, so I can't remember how to end it grammatically. Anyway, I'm going to keep practicing. The time of recording is the 12th. I've still got, the talk is on the 23rd, so I've still got 11 days and I'm going to practice it every day. So hopefully by the 23rd this will be a bit more polished. Anyway, Gareth's not going to come to the actual event, and neither is Howell, because they were busy elsewhere. But perhaps I will see you there. I hope you enjoyed listening to that, and I will be back with more! Thanks for listening as always. Please like, subscribe, comment below. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye now. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.